Well, let's continue our little delve into Boswell's life of Johnson. I am fully aware of the objections which may be made to the minuteness on some occasions of my detail of Johnson's conversation, and how happily it is adapted for the petty exercise of ridicule by men of superficial understanding, and ludicrous fancy. But I remain firm and confident in my opinion that minute particulars are frequently characteristic and always amusing when they relate to an distinguished man. I am therefore exceedingly unwilling that anything, however slight, which my illustrious friend thought it worth his while to express with any degree of point, should perish. For this almost superstitious reverence I have found very old and venerable authority quoted by our great modern prelate, Secker, in whose 10th sermon there is the following passage. And he quotes, Rabbi David Kimchi, a noted Jewish commentator, who lived above 500 years ago, explains that passage in the first psalm, His leaf also shall not wither, from rabbins, yet older than himself thus. That even the idle talk, so he expressed it, of a good man ought to be regarded. The most superfluous thing he saith are always of some value. And other ancient authors have the same phrase nearly in the same sense. Of one thing I am certain, that considering how highly the small portion which we have of the table talk and other anecdotes of our celebrated writers is valued, and how earnestly it is regretted that we have not more, I am justified in preserving rather too many of Johnson's sayings than too few. Especially as from the diversity of dispositions it cannot be known with certainty beforehand whether what may seem trifling to some, and perhaps to the collector himself, may not be more agreeable to many. And the greater number than an author can please in any degree, the more pleasure does this arise to a benevolent mind. To those who are weak enough to think this a degrading task, and the time and labor which have been devoted to it misemployed, I shall content myself with opposing the authority of the great man of any age, Julius Caesar, of whom Bacon observes that in his book of Apothegms, which he collected, we see that he esteemed it more honor to make himself but a pair of tables, to take the wise and pithy words of others, than to have every word of his own to be made an apothegm or an oracle. Having said thus much by way of introduction, I commit the following pages to the candor of the public. Samuel Johnson was born in Lichfield in Staffordshire on the 18th of September, NS 1709, and his initiation into the Christian Church was not delayed, for his baptism is recorded in the register of St. Mary's Parish in that city to have been performed on the day of his birth. His father is there styled gentleman, a circumstance of which an ignorant panegyrist has praised him for not being proud, when the truth is that the appellation of gentleman, though now lost in the indiscriminate assumption of esquire, was commonly taken by those who could not boast of gentility. His father was Michael Johnson, a native of Derbyshire, an obscure extraction, who settled in Lichfield as a bookseller and stationer. His mother was Sarah Ford, descendant of an ancient race of substantial yeomanry in Warwickshire. They were well advanced in years when they married, and never had more than 2 children, both sons. Samuel, their firstborn, who lived to be the illustrious character whose various excellence I am endeavored to record, and Nathaniel, who died in his 25th year. Mr. Michael Johnson was a man of a large and robust body, and of a strong and active mind. Yet, as in the most solid rocks veins of unsound substance are often discovered, there was in him a mixture of the disease, the nature of which eludes the most minute inquiry through the effects that are well known to be a weariness of life, an unconcern about those things which agitate the greater part of mankind, and a general sensation of gloomy wretchedness. From him, then, his son inherited, with some other qualities, a vile melancholy, which is too strong expression of any disturbance of the mind, made him mad all his life, at least not sober. There's a footnote here. Journal of a Tour to the Hebrides. Michael was, however, forced to be the narrowest of his circumstances to be very vigilant in business, not only in his shop, but by occasionally resorting to several towns in the neighborhood, some of which were at a considerable distance from Lichfield. There's a footnote here. Extract of a letter dated Trentham, St. Peter's Day, 1716, written by the Reverend George Plaxton, chaplain at the time to Lord Gower, which may serve to show the high estimation in which the father of our great moralist was held. Johnson, the Lichfield librarian, is now here. He propagates learning all over the diocese, and advanceth knowledge to its just height. All the clergy here are his pupils, and suck all they have from him. Allen cannot make a warrant about his president, nor our quondam John Evans draw a recognizable sine directione Michaelis. Gentleman's Magazine, October 1791. Back to the story at hand. At that time, booksellers' shops in the provincial towns of England were very rare, so that there were not one even in Birmingham, in which town old Mr. Johnson used to open a shop every market day. He was a pretty good Latin scholar, and a citizen so credible as to be made one of the magistrates of Lichfield, and being a man of great sense and skill in his trade, he acquired a reasonable share of wealth, of which, however, he afterwards lost the greatest part by engaging unsuccessfully in a manufacture of parchment. He was a zealous high churchman and a royalist, and retained his attachment to the unfortunate house of Stuart, though he reconciled himself by casuistical arguments of expediency and necessity to take the oaths imposed by the prevailing power. There is a circumstance in his life somewhat romantic, but so well authenticated that I shall not omit it. A young woman of Leek, in Staffordshire, while he served his apprenticeship there, conceived a violent passion for him, and though it met with no favourable return, followed him to Lichfield, where she took lodgings opposite to the house in which he lived, and indulged her hopeless flame. When he was informed that it so preyed upon her mind that her life was in danger, he, with a generous humanity, went to her and offered to marry her, but it was then too late. Her vital power was exhausted, and she actually exhibited one of the very rare instances of dying for love. She was buried in the cathedral of Lichfield, and he, with a tender regard, placed a stone over her grave with this inscription: "Here lies the body of Mrs. Elizabeth Blaney, a stranger. She departed this life 20th of September, 1694. That was all Johnson's father. Johnson's mother was a woman of distinguished understanding. I asked his old schoolfellow, Mr. Hector, surgeon, of Birmingham, if she was no vain of her son. He said, she had too much good sense to be vain, but she knew her son's value. Her piety was not inferior to her understanding, and to her must be ascribed those early impressions of religion upon the mind of her son, from which the world afterwards derived so much benefit. He told me that he remembered distinctly having had the first notice of heaven, a place to which good people went, and hell, a place to which bad people went, communicated to him by her, when a little child in bed with her, and that it might be the better fixed in his memory, she sent him to repeat it to Thomas Jackson, their manservant. He not being in the way, this was not done. But there was no occasion for any artificial aid for its preservation. It following so very eminent a man from his cradle to his grave, every minute particular, which can throw light on the progress of his mind, is interesting. That he was remarkable even in his earliest years may easily be supposed. For to use his own words in his Life of Sydenham, and we quote here, that the strength of his understanding, the accuracy of his discernment, and ardor of his curiosity might have been remarked from his infancy by a diligent observer, there is no reason to doubt. For there is no instance of any man whose history has been minutely related, that did not in every part of life discover that some proportion of intellectual vigor. End quote. In all such investigations, it is certainly unwise to pay too much attention to incidents which the credulous relate with eager satisfaction, and the more scrupulous or witty inquirer considers only in topics of ridicule. Yet there is a traditional story of the infant Hercules of Toryism, so curiously characteristic that I shall not withhold it. It was communicated to me in a letter from Miss Mary Addy of Lichfield. In quotes now again. When Dr. Sedgefield was at Lichfield, Johnson was not quite 3 years old. My grandfather Hammond observed him at the cathedral, perched upon his father's shoulders, listening and gaping at the much celebrated preacher. Mr. Hammond asked Mr. Johnson how he could possibly think of bringing such an infant to church, and in the midst of so great a crowd. He answered because it was impossible to keep him at home. For young as he was, he believed he had caught the public spirit and zeal for sacrament, and would have stayed forever in the church, satisfied with beholding him. End of quote. Nor can I omit a little instance of that jealous independence of spirit and impetuosity of temper which never forsook him. The fact was acknowledged to me by himself upon the authority of his mother. One day, when the servants who used to be sent to school to conduct him home had not come in time, he set out by himself, though he was so nearsighted that he was obliged to stoop down on his hands and knees to take a view of the kennel before he ventured to step over it. His schoolmistress, afraid that he might miss his way or fall into the kennel or be run over by a cart, followed him at some distance. He happened to turn over and perceive her. Feeling her careful attention as an insult to his manliness, he ran back to her in a rage and beat her as well as his strength would permit. On the power of his memory, for which he was all his life eminent to a degree almost incredible, the following early instance was told me in his presence at Lichfield in 1776 by his stepdaughter, Mrs. Lucy Porter, as related to her by his mother. When he was a child in petticoats, and he learned to read, Mrs. Johnson one morning put the common prayer book into his hands, pointed to the collect for the day, and said, "Sam, you must get this by heart." She went upstairs, leaving him to study it. But by the time she had reached the second floor, she heard him following her. "What's the matter?" said she. "I can say it," he replied, and repeated it distinctly, though he could not have read it over more than twice. But there has been another story of his infant precocity, generally circulated and generally believed, the truth of which I am to refute only upon his own authority. It is told, in the Anecdotes of Dr. Johnson, that, when a child of 3 years old, he chanced to tread upon a duckling, the 11th of a brood, and killed it, upon which, it is said, he dictated to his mother the following epitaph: "Here lies good Master Duck, whom Samuel Johnson trod on. If it had lived, it had been good luck, for then we'd have an odd one." And this is surely internal evidence that this little composition combines in it what no child of 3 years old could produce, without an extension of its faculties by immediate inspiration. Yet Mrs. Lucy Porter, Dr. Johnson's stepdaughter, positively maintained to me, in his presence, that there could be no doubt of the truth of this anecdote, for she had heard it from his mother. So difficult is it to obtain an authentic relation of facts, and such authority may there be for error, for he assured me that his father made the verses and wished to pass them for his child's. He added, my father was a foolish old man, that is to say, foolish in talking of his children. And now here's another footnote. This anecdote of the duck, though disproved by internal and external evidence, has nevertheless, upon supposition of its truth, been made the foundation of the following ingenious and fanciful reflections of Miss Seward amongst the communications concerning Dr. Johnson with which she has been pleased to favor me. In quotes, these infant numbers contain the seeds of those propensities which through his life so strongly marked his character, of that poetic talent which afterwards bore such rich and plentiful fruits. For, excepting his orthographic works, everything which Dr. Johnson wrote was poetry, whose essence consists not in numbers or in jingle, but in the strength and glow of fancy, for which all the stores of nature and of art stand in prompt administration, and in eloquence which conveys their blended illustrious illustrations in a language more turnable than need of rhyme or verse to add more harmony. The above little verses also show that superstitious bias which grew with his growth and strengthened with his strength, and of late years particularly injured his happiness by presenting to him the gloomy side of religion rather than the bright and cheering one which gilded the period of closing life with the light of pious hope. This is so beautifully imagined that I would not suppress it, but like many other theories, it is deduced from support fact which is indeed a fiction. So I don't know why I included it in there, since he didn't even write that fucking poem. Anyway, that's enough for today. Woof. All these footnotes and this kind of writing is going to be tough getting through this, but hey, I'm going to do it. I said I was going to do it, so I'm going to do it. Anyway, bye from Boswell. Toodaloo.